Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel. I do hope this finds you very well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so excited that you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight, because boy is it an exciting story. Olivia knows that somebody is stalking her. Somebody, since she's moved into her mother's house called Silver Lakes, she knows that somebody is trying to harass her. Somebody is trying to follow her, and she wants to get to the bottom of this mystery, to find out who it is. And so she's about to clandestinely follow this person to see where they go, so that she can find out who her stalker is. So let's continue with part 3 of our story. I found the kitchen door key, and I gingerly slipped it into the lock. The door squeaked open. I was met by some abrupt, cool gusts of breeze as I slipped clandestinely into the night with the stealth of a burglar. I'd never enjoyed wandering around in the dark before. Even as a kid, I'd been terribly afraid of the long, lonely night hours that invited haunted imagery to always engage my nightmares that were vivid as a child. On this night, my fears were contained outside of my body, like the bugs in a glass jar. I could not afford to give them my attention, or I would never have the courage to venture out on my own like this. I really needed to do this. I cautiously scrambled over the damp, manicured grass that felt like a wet, dewy carpet beneath my feet. I noticed my stalker glance up at my bedroom window one more time, as if hoping to catch sight of me. The stalker appeared to have given up for the evening, and was clearly deciding to make tracks from whence they'd come. What they failed to realize was that I was following furtively behind them. There were a few street lights dappling the street in a faint, very useful illumination, which meant walking down the street was pretty straightforward. But I hugged all the dark shadows and used the tall, lofty trees on the pavement to cover up my pathway. I could hear the sound of an owl hooting in the darkness, intermingled with the cheerful chorus of the frogs and crickets. There was a couple of raccoons who had toppled over a bin somewhere, and the noise of the bin hitting the ground so forcefully had made them scamper away. I also had nearly jumped out of my skin with fright. At the noisy interference, my stalker promptly turned around, and with their flashlight had lit up the 2 frightened raccoons, who bolted away hurriedly, not appreciating being caught up in the glare of someone's spotlight. I heard my stalker chuckle to themselves, as if he or she was rather amused by the sight of the raccoons, while my heart was now beating thunderously hard inside of my chest. I was so terribly afraid of being seen by my stalker. Everything was steeped in an uncongenial, tenebrific darkness. The sky was like black tea, the houses devoid of all light, as if everyone had long since retired to bed. The time on my watch was 1:45 in the morning. I stealthily continued to follow after the black figure, who from time to time would occasionally stop, look back over their shoulders to check that they were not being followed. For a moment I was afraid they could sense my presence, but they continued to nonchalantly amble down the street, their dark clothes blending into the darkness so perfectly that sometimes I would almost lose sight of them for a moment. I had made it down the street without being seen, but I couldn't afford to let my cover be blown under any circumstances. I held a torch in my hand, but I couldn't use it at this moment. Ostensibly right now, I had recruited the darkness as my friend, so that I could hide within her cunning folds. When the figure reached the end of the street, they took the right-hand bend that veered off the road towards a footpath on the side of the purple house that belonged to old Mrs. von Gennen, who loved the colour purple. The path unfortunately led straight through the wood grove. My heart sank. I did not want to go through the woods at this time of night, to follow some obscure figure. But if I didn't, I might not find out who it was that was stalking me. I really needed to know the answer to that question, so I could not employ any bashful reticence or reservation. I realized the figure had taken a shortcut through the woods to get to our street, which meant the stalker probably lived on the other side of the wood grove, in another neighbourhood bordering the woods, of which there were a select few. I needed to find out who the stalker was, so I couldn't indulge the faint ramblings of my vacillating hesitancy to sabotage my success. I needed to do this. I summoned up all the courage I could and trailed after the figure in the woods. The light of my stalker's torch lit up the way, as the moonlight spilling through the densely shaded trees was very minimal. I needed to enjoy the benefits of my stalker's torch, so I had to remain close behind them. I couldn't use my own torch, for if I did, I would draw immediate attention to myself. I am not sure what propelled me forward to walk under the canopy of the tall, lofty trees. I felt like a puppet on a string, as if a puppeteer was calling all the shots for me, directing my every single move. I needed to be extremely careful in the woods, very careful indeed, because if I so much as trampled on a twig that snapped under my feet, my stalker might realize I was there, and the crackling sound of leaf litter being trampled would get their attention. On many occasions my stalkers stopped and listened intently, as if they sensed somebody was trailing behind them. At one point I heard a young girl's voice saying, "Is anybody there? Is anybody there?" But the voice was met by an ominous silence. What the hell, I thought. My stalker was a woman, and a young one at that. The voice sounded like that of a teenager. I felt a little more self-assured, knowing that my stalker wasn't a man. I surreptitiously continued to follow the shadowy figure through the woods, until the woods ended by the intrusion of a long, windy asphalt road. I noticed opposite the sprawling grove of trees on the other side of the road were several houses, clustered together side by side. My stalker ambled over to a house directly opposite the woodgrove, with a sign on the outside which read "The Groves." The figure in the hoodie pulled off the hoodie, shook out a tumble of long blonde hair, and cautiously made their way into a house, slipping in through the front door very quietly, and looking out towards the woods. I could only hope she, whoever she was, had not seen me, or sensed my presence. I watched the young lady closing the door behind her, and a light going on in the entrance hall. I had hit pay dirt. I knew where my stalker lived, and I knew she was a young teenager. I felt victorious, as if a huge weight was being lifted off my shoulders. I would now begin my own spying on the young lady who had been stalking me. I needed to find out exactly who she was, and why she was pursuing me and sending me all these nasty notes in the post. I was going to have my answers very soon, and that thought brought me monumental relief. Alas, retracing my walk through the woods was rather daunting, and not very easy. This time I was not focused on the figure ahead of me that I'd been following, so I became much more conscious and aware of the darkness that cocooned me on every side. And with every single rustle and every strange sound I heard, I became extremely skittish and on edge. In a trice, everything became deadly quiet in the woods. I was aware only of my breathing and the sound of my heart thundering in my ears. Someone was there. I was absolutely sure of it. I could feel eyes burning into the back of my neck. I needed to get out of here as fast as I possibly could. Something felt terribly wrong. I stepped up my speed, moving as quickly as I could through the trees. My fear dismantled my focus and abruptly put me into a frenzied, uncoordinated spin, so that I found myself being propelled rather aimlessly by hasty, ungainly movements which blindly obscured my focus. I failed to see an overhanging branch that obstructed my pathway. I went clumsily flying into that branch. My head was hit with a forceful thump that was almost as bad as if someone had hit me with a cast-iron fire poker to knock me out. I was thrown back onto my feet, and everything went black. I am not sure how long I'd been knocked out for. When I started to come around, I heard two faint female voices conversing together that I believed was part of a dream. Kagilato, makati, alikako, atacha, ikalakolo, mata, nikalaso. What were they saying? Their voices seemed so muted, so far away, distant, but the words were spoken in an incomprehensible language that I did not understand or even know. I could feel my body being touched. Someone was shaking me very gently, as if trying to rouse me from a deep slumber. My head was throbbing violently. The shaking persisted. Slowly but surely, I reluctantly opened my eyes. I tried to adjust to the burgeoning morning light that filtered through the trees. That was when I became very aware of my surroundings. I was lying on a forest floor under the canopy of trees, and that was when I saw two very large figures standing over me, with expressions of concerned bewilderment dappling their dark eyes. This had to be a dream. This could not be real. In a trice, I recalled the events of the previous night and how I had followed the stranger through the woods. I had been knocked out by that tree branch on the way back home, and everything had grown black. I could hear the pretty bird song in the woods, so I knew where I was. It sounded like the morning dawn chorus. I felt dizzy, disorientated, and very confused, a little like you do when you come around from an anaesthetic after you had an operation. I really was beginning to wonder if I might be hallucinating. I knew that what I was seeing could not be a trick of the light. Two female Bigfoots were standing over me. One was holding my arm. The other was pushing me up into a sitting position so that my back rested against the trunk of a tree. These creatures were so intimidating, so Herculean in size, that you'd have expected me to be frightened out of my skull. But they spoke to me in soothing voices, stroked me gently with their hands, as if encouraging me to get up. Kitaki, mokolabi, akasi. I was so confused and so bemused that I stared incredulously at the two Bigfoots, as if I was seeing aliens from out of space. For I had never believed in a million months of Sundays that these cryptid creatures were actually real. Even in my foggy, rather blurred state, I knew that what I was beholding was real indeed. Both the Bigfoots were easily between 8 to 9 foot tall, possibly taller. I couldn't be sure. Their lanky, lean bodies were robust and powerful, heavily muscular, their breasts small, their hair a dark cinnamon shade. The female Bigfoot was dabbing my head wound with some crushed leaves that smelt of peppermints. I could taste blood in my mouth, and when I put fingers on my head wound, I could see fresh blood on my fingers. I must have taken quite a beating from that tree branch, I thought. I could feel a big bump in my fingers as I traced my hairline. I knew I'd run directly into that tree branch when terror had gripped my heart. Perhaps it was the Bigfoots, who were now nursing me very kindly, that I had been running from. I knew something had been watching me in the woods. The Bigfoot pointed to my head and said something to me in a language I had no way of understanding, but it was like the meaning of her words suddenly just filtered into my head. Kilatikwa, hampala, hila kolopasi. You had a nasty fall. You hit your head when you ran straight into a tree branch. I've been trying to wake you up for a long time, but you were out cold. You must get up. The female Bigfoot, with a comforting overlong arm and powerful hand with fingers the size of sausages, pulled me up gently to my feet. I felt dizzy and disorientated, as if my knees were beginning to fold beneath me, and there were shooting pains going off in my head. The Bigfoot held me up, guiding me down the earthen path, step by step, helping me to put weight on my feet, and encouraging me with her words. Both Bigfoots clapped enthusiastically when I made a little progress down the footpath, almost as if I was a toddler learning to walk for the very first time. Soon I managed to walk unaided, with the two female Bigfoots standing at my side, encouraging my laboured efforts all the way. The taller of the two female Bigfoots asked me if I was going to be all right. Kipaki, ikala. I looked up at her pyramid face and into her chocolate brown eyes, and in her eyes I saw only love and kindness. Kilaki kwasi, matala. You can stay with us if you want to, until you get better, she told me. I never said anything, but the Bigfoots must have heard my very thoughts that I was thinking. because I was thinking at that very moment that I needed to get back to Lenny, that he'd be worrying about me. The female Bigfoot nodded, as if she perfectly understood my thoughts. She said something to the other Bigfoot, who nodded at her and looked at me with warm eyes. The Bigfoots accompanied me to the edge of the woods, and then they nodded at me once I reached the path that led up the street. "Where the hell have you been?" asked Lenny when I walked into the house. He looked at me in abject horror when he saw the trail of blood on my head and the leaves in my hair, along with the dirt on my clothes. "What the hell happened to you, love? Are you all right? Your head is bleeding." "Oh, don't fuss, Lenny. I just walked into a tree branch, that's all. Hit my head. I took a bit of a tumble." "Where were you? I woke up at 7 o'clock this morning and you were not in bed. I was worried sick about you. Turns out I was right. Look at you. You go off for a walk and then you go and do something like that to your head. That injury on your head does not look good. There's blood all over your face. And all this green stuff. I can't work out what that is." What my husband failed to know was that I'd been gone for several hours, and I was not about to reveal that to him. The clock in the kitchen said it was 8:05. I must have been knocked out for quite some time in the woodgrove, but I chose not to share the sobering information with my husband, for he would have freaked out had he known what I'd really got up to during the night. The less he knew about it, the better. "I just couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk in the woods very early this morning. There's a lovely footpath near the purple house at the bottom of the road that leads into the woods. I went there." "Why did you not tell me where you were going, love? You know I need to know where you are. I don't like to wake up and find the house completely empty. I mean, you could at least have left me a note, couldn't you?" "I didn't want to wake you up," I lied. "You were fast asleep. I thought I'd be back before you got up. Turns out I was wrong." "Turns out you had a nasty fall. I don't like the look of that blood all over your head. You look as if you've got quite a bump on your head. I don't understand how you managed to walk in a tree branch like that in the morning. Surely you saw the overhanging branch. I need to clean you up and see if we need to take you to the hospital to get some stitches. That bump on your head looks pretty nasty. And what on earth is that green stuff all over your face?" I remembered the Bigfoot had been rubbing leaves on my skin, but I said nothing. "I've no idea. And you really are fussing, Lenny. For goodness sake, I'm going to be absolutely fine." "It seems to me, love, that you've become rather accident-prone of late. I worry about you, which I'm entitled to do as your husband." Jamie's account. I knew I should not be stalking Olivia, whose married name was Fleming. I couldn't help myself, following her around all the time. I wanted to scare her half to death. She deserved to be frightened out of her wits for what she'd done to me all those years ago. I wanted to make her pay, and pay big time. I hoped every night when she went to bed her knees were trembling, and if she was always wondering if this was the night that I was out there watching her. I'd been stalking her on and off, so she could never be sure when I would make my appearance. I didn't want to be predictable. It would be good to keep the woman on her toes. I knew I wasn't very big, but I hoped with my black hoodie and with the extra large shoulder pads I'd sewn into the fabric that I would look menacing and intimidating. I was fortunate to be tall, so I'm sure Olivia would believe I was a man. I wanted her to know she was being stalked. I had sent her threatening, malicious notes through her letterbox addressed to her saying, "I'm always watching you. You can look out of your bedroom window, and I will be there watching you. I'm going to make you pay for what you did." And of course, I meant every word of it. I felt great satisfaction when I could see the fear in Olivia's eyes as she reluctantly pulled back the curtains from her bedroom window on the upper floor of her home, and she saw me staring up at her. It felt so good to cause her such angst, to rattle the woman. There was no doubt I succeeded in my endeavours. The woman looked freaked out. I could see the anguish in her eyes. I felt no pity for her in that regard. She deserved to suffer, and I hoped I was hurting her as she had hurt me. I had been following Olivia around all the time, when it suited me to do so. My anger towards her was like an insatiable wildfire that could not be contained or put out. People know when they're being watched, don't they? But the great thing was that Olivia did not know who was watching her. That was the whole point. It was freaking her out. I wanted to get her back for what she had treacherously done to me all those years ago. Or more to the point, what she'd wanted to do to me, which was even worse than what she actually did. I knew what she was like. She was a wicked cow. I'd heard it all from her own mother, Prudence, who put me well into the picture. It had come as a shock to me when a woman by the name of Prudence Wallace had got in touch with me. The message she had sent me had turned my blood to ice. "You do not know me, Jamie, dear, but I've been watching you grow up for all these years, and you've grown up into a lovely teenager, I see. You do not live far from me. I made sure of that geographical convenience when you were adopted, so that I could observe you growing up from a distance. I'm your grandmother. I hate to tell you this, dear, but I'm dying of cancer, and I wish to see you before I depart this earth. If you doubt you're adopted, you can look for your birth certificate, and you will see that you very much are adopted. Your mother's name was Olivia Wallace, and it will be on your birth certificate. It is now Fleming, as my daughter is married. She's living in Nova Scotia, I believe. Olivia was my daughter. She gave birth to you when she was a teenager herself. I had no idea she was pregnant at the time, even though I should have guessed, given her weight gain. Your mother gave birth to you on the kitchen floor, would you believe, all those years ago. You were born a healthy 6 pounds, 2 ounces. I haven't got long to live, dear, so I think it only fair if you know the truth that you are adopted. Please contact me." When I read the alarming message, the kind of message that no teenager ever wants to receive, I thought someone psychotic was toying with me. I ignored the message. Yet despite everything, the dismaying message haunted my mind. I could think of little else. Supposing it was true, that just did not bear thinking about at all. I loved my parents, so the thought of being adopted was something I didn't want to even contemplate. I realized I'd never seen my birth certificate before. It was not something I'd considered examining until now. It would seem when someone tells you that you're adopted, then you know you need to find the evidence to prove that such an outrageous, inappropriate suggestion is absolutely wrong. There was no way I was adopted. I could not be. I wanted to prove it. The burning need to know the truth overcame me. I knew where my father punctiliously kept all our passports. We had a safe that we hid behind a large painting. He used his birth date as the combination number for the safe, as well as the number for his cell phone. I was absolutely certain that he'd keep all valuable documents in the safe. That would include marriage certificates, identification documents, and birth certificates. It seemed like the most obvious place to search for my birth certificate, but I was terribly afraid of what I would find, as deep down in the core of my being, I knew that my very worst fears would likely be confirmed. Growing up, I had been well aware that I didn't look remotely like both of my parents. My blonde hair was enigmatic to anybody who knew me, for both of my parents were dark, so it had never made sense to me that I didn't look like them. It was with trembling hands that I grudgingly opened the safe. My parents had gone off together to pick up some Chinese takeaways for dinner, while I remained at home, claiming I had some homework I needed to complete, when in truth I had another agenda on my mind. I knew my parents would be away for a mere 10 minutes or so. The family safe was discreetly hidden behind the oil painting of the blue irises, which was a very good copy of Van Gogh's work. I put the surprisingly heavy picture down on the floor. It balanced precariously against the wall. I diffidently opened the safe, using my father's combination number. It worked. I found a few jewelry boxes scattered around the safe that belonged to my mother. Beneath the boxes I saw a collection of papers and passports, clustered together in a large plastic envelope. I pulled out the envelope and hastily sifted through the papers. One of them was my birth certificate. For a moment I could hardly breathe. I avoided looking at the birth certificate. My heart was doing twisted somersaults in my chest. I suddenly realized I really did not want to look at my birth certificate. I was terribly afraid of what I would read. Like some people are terrified of looking at the number on the scale that proves their worst fears have been confirmed, that they've put on weight after Christmas dinner. For a brief moment I was tempted to shove the paperwork back into the safe and pretend I had not received that creepy message from the old woman. But an invisible cord seemed to pull my eyes down onto the page, forcing me to read the contents on the paper. My name stood there loud and clear, Lisa Jamie Wallace. And then I read the name of my mother, Olivia Wallace, and father was left blank. My guts inside my belly began to squirm. Those were not the names of my parents. I could see there were also adoption papers in the safe. My heart plummeted. I was definitely adopted. The old woman, Prudence Wallace, who had contacted me, was absolutely right. I could hear my parents' car now rolling up the drive. They were coming back. They were coming back. I couldn't examine the papers any more intently. But I didn't need to do so. I'd seen enough. I'd seen far too much. I hurriedly thrust everything together, putting it back into the safe as quickly as I could, before my parents entered the house, carrying the Chinese takeaways in their hands and calling after me. "Jamie, we're back! I've got your absolute favourite, love," said my mother enthusiastically. "Sweet and sour pork, chicken chow mein, prawn crackers and chicken spring rolls." I could feel the anger bubble up inside me. "I'm not hungry," I said, going back to my bedroom and slamming the door furiously behind me. The two people I loved more than anything in the entire world had perfidiously betrayed my trust, and the last thing I wanted to do was to enjoy dinner with them. How could they adopt me and not tell me about it? I was now seeing my parents as being treacherously disloyal and duplicitous. I could hear my mother saying to my father, "What on earth is wrong with Jamie? She was perfectly all right when we left to get the takeaways, and now she's being quite grouchy and cranky. She's normally such an agreeable teenager. What on earth has got into her?" She could hear her father letting out a muted chuckle. "Teenagers, eh? It's those racing hormones flying all over the place. Leave her be. I'm sure she'll eat some of the leftovers later, when her appetite returns. When you're Jamie's age, your emotions do somersaults all the time. I know what I was like back then. I don't know how my parents ever put up with me." "You don't think someone at school has upset her, do you, love?" "Whatever it is, I'm sure she'll work it out. Give her some time." When I was in my bedroom, I contacted the woman I believed was my grandmother, Prudence Wallace, and arranged to meet her the following day after school. "I'm so very glad you called, dear. I was expecting you to. I'm sure you must have found your birth certificate, so you do know that you're adopted now. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person. I live very close to you, at Silver Lake's house. You can't miss it." Prudence Wallace was not kidding about that. I knew I could take a shortcut through the woods, and I could be at her house within 15 minutes. My grandmother lived so close to me. Maybe she had been keeping a watch over me all these years. But I needed to find out where I came from, and who my birth mother actually was, and why she'd actually given me up for adoption. I had so many questions whirling around in my head, which I needed answers for. My parents had noticed I had become ungraciously moody, and rather belligerent of late, snapping at them at any given opportunity. But I was so furious with them for keeping me in the dark about being adopted. Everything I thought I knew about myself was a big fat lie. The following day, when the school bus dropped me off at the top of Greenway Street, with a knapsack over my back, I took a shortcut through the woods and followed the trail that completed itself on the edge of a large-looking purple house. I was now on 5th Street, where all the houses with their pristine front yards were a cluster of personalities, like a group of people hanging together from different generations. It would seem new, more recently built houses blended seamlessly with old Victorians and Queen Anne styles. It was rather an enchanting, eclectic mix. The street was beautiful, with the exception, of course, of my grandmother's house, that stood out like an ugly sore thumb, like a disfigured, intrusive weed growing among the roses. Prudence Wallace told me her house was called Silver Lakes, which I thought was odd, as the house did not overlook any lake. But maybe the initial owners of the old property thought the name was pretty, and so it stuck. Or perhaps there really had been a lake in front of the house in the olden days. I couldn't be sure. My grandmother's run-down, neglected, slovenly-looking house was the messiest and most unkempt house in the entire street. It was in a right bedraggled and disordered state, with long grass growing up wildly against the front door, weeds burgeoning all over the place, ivy suffocating the flower beds and strangling a selection of old rose bushes. There was peeling paint on the walls and window panes that were rotting. I knew houses with this kind of illustrious history behind them should be well preserved and well maintained, but this place had been left to decay, like an old tooth in a pair of receding gums. I reluctantly walked across a stone path that was heavily overgrown to a scuffed, heavily scratched front door. I tapped on it very gently. I was clandestinely hoping that no one would answer the door, so that I could run straight back home. But I could hear a shuffle of light footsteps and a soft female voice calling out, "I'm coming! Be there in a sec!" I was greeted to a fresh-faced nurse in her early 30s. She was wearing a smart blue uniform and offered me a bright, sunny smile as she opened the door to me. "Oh, you must be Jamie. Prudence is expecting you. Don't be too stressed out by her appearance. I need to warn you about that. She's a very sick woman, you see. Come this way. Be careful you don't trip over any landmines. I need to warn you, they're lying all over the floor, I'm afraid. Mrs. Wallace is quite the hoarder, so this place is a bit of an obstacle course." Mrs. Wallace's house smelt rather niffy. I tentatively walked over mountains of plastic bags, stacks of books and newspapers, an abundance of plastic bottles. How could anyone collect so much rubbish, I wondered? If this was what hoarding was like, I wanted absolutely no part of it. The nurse beckoned me up the creaking staircase, lined with a thin ribbon of threadbare carpet. I followed her up to the first room on the right. She tapped on the door. "Mrs. Wallace, Jamie's here to see you." "Come in, Jamie," came an old woman's croaky voice. Mrs. Wallace had been propped up against the puffed-up pillars of her bed, as if she was expecting me. I noticed her nightstand was covered in medicine bottles, and there was a tumbler of water by her side. Prudence Wallace's face was paper-thin, very pale. She looked like a fragile porcelain doll that had not had its face painted yet. One brief glance at her told me that Mrs. Wallace was very ill indeed. She had a throaty cough and was always breathless. Sometimes she sounded as if she had sand in the back of her throat, as she struggled to speak. I could see she was thin like a matchstick, which made her face look more like a skull with sunken hollows. She had dark moons of bruised skin framing her eyes, and a thin sprinkling of white hair on top of her head, which barely covered the pink skull that peered beneath. Was this what dying looked like, I wondered? It certainly wasn't pretty. She frowned at me. "Don't be shy, Jamie, love. Come and sit next to your grandmother, will you?" She pointed to a chair covered with a colourful crocheted shawl on the side of her bed. "You can go now, nurse," she said very sharply. "I'd like to spend some private time with my granddaughter, if you don't mind. We have a lot of catching up to do, don't we, Jamie?" I nodded, and anxiously sat down on the chair, removing the crocheted shawl, as it smelt rather manky. I put my satchel down on the floor beside me, and sat there nervously, looking up at Mrs. Wallace. I suddenly felt like all I wanted to do was to get out of this house as fast as I could. But instead I remained stoically seated on the chair, my school shoes tapping nervously against the thick woolly rug splayed out on the floor. Mrs. Wallace gave me a smile. "Don't be nervous, love. I can see you're terribly nervous. I know it's scary looking at a dying woman. I'm sure it's not a very attractive sight, but I assure you I won't bite. I just needed to see you before I breathe my very last. I will be lucky if I last the week. Thank you for getting in touch with me. Did you know you were adopted? No, my parents never told me. I found my birth certificate in the safe. When I saw my mother's name was Olivia Wallace, I knew your message had to be true, which is why I came here. I was very upset about it all, as you can imagine. I'm very sorry, love. It must have come as an awful shock. But I did want to see you, and I think you do deserve to know the truth, don't you? Doesn't everybody deserve to know the truth? My parents should have told me the truth. They should have told me I was adopted. Don't be too hard on them, dear. Maybe in the circumstances they probably thought it was best you didn't know the truth. Your parents really wanted a baby. Your mother was infertile, I'm afraid. She tried all that IVF treatment with no success whatsoever. I remember at church there were intercessory prayers prayed for your mother to help her fall pregnant, but she never did. So when you came along, I suggested that they both adopted you. They believed you were a gift of God. Your mother was so happy to have you in her life. She was thrilled to bits. It was the best of both worlds for me, as I could watch you grow up from a close distance, knowing you were my grandchild. Although I gave your parents my word that I didn't want to be involved in your life, I thought that would interfere with everything. So I would watch you at church every Sunday with your parents. I knew putting you up for adoption had been a very good decision on my part, because your parents loved the bones of you. I'm sure you know that already, though. But what about my birth mother? Why did she not keep me? And where's my birth father? Why did they give me up for adoption? I don't understand. Ah, well, my dear, the less you know about your birth mother, the better. Let's just say that she was not a good woman by any manner of means. You can count your lucky stars she never raised you. Believe me, dear, you had a lucky escape from that one. At this my heart began to thunder violently in my chest. What do you mean? Your mother was 16 years old when she had you. She was your age. Can you believe that? She had the morals of an alley cat back in the day. Absolutely no self-respect. She threw herself at the young boys indiscriminately. You know the type, as promiscuous as a bunny rabbit. She dressed like a real skank as well. She knew she was very pretty and she flaunted it. You look a lot like her, actually. I suppose I should have known she was pregnant. She kept wearing baggy sweatshirts and leggings to hide her deceit from me. I accused her of eating far too much pie. Can you believe that? I thought she was getting fat, when all the time she was pregnant. What a fool I was. It never occurred to me that she was pregnant. She hid that from me well, you see. I never suspected a single thing. One night I was woken up to this whimpering sound. It sounded like an animal in distress. The sound was coming from the kitchen. I couldn't work out what on earth it was. It gave me quite the start, it did. That was when I found my daughter in the kitchen, giving birth to you. I could see your head was halfway out of her. I had to deliver you myself with lots of towels and hot water bottles, stuff like that. My daughter was crying. She didn't want you. She wanted to throw you into the trash bin and dispose of you. Pretend you never existed. But I would have none of it. I insisted my daughter went to hospital for her recovery, and that you were put up for adoption. And finally she agreed to follow my lead. She wanted to wipe her hands of you, you know. She had absolutely no heart. I stared at my grandmother incredulously, through round eyes, wondering if I'd heard right. My mother wanted to dispose of me. Throw me in a dumpster. Is that what you're saying? I'm afraid so, love. I know it's not easy to hear, but my daughter was a cold, emotionless fish, and it's best you know the truth. She didn't want a baby. She wanted to party all the time. She was a very irresponsible girl. That's why I persuaded her to sign over the papers for your adoption to your parents. And she did so, thanks to me. As a result, you've had a good childhood. Things could have been so different for you if I hadn't put it all right. I dread to think what your mother would have done with you had I not woken up that night. If it hadn't been for my intervention, she could have stuffed you in a plastic bag and thrown you in the trash. And none of us would be the wiser, would we? No, that can't be true. She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't do that. That can't be true. Don't get upset, my dear. I'm telling you the truth. My blood went cold as my grandmother said this to me. I detected a smug look of satisfaction on her face, as if she'd got some kind of macabre kick out of telling me this. I didn't like my grandmother one bit. She was probably a narcissist, like her daughter was, because her daughter wanted to dispose of me. How could her daughter have no compassion on a baby that was born to her, a baby that was her own child? I didn't know that human beings could be so acrimoniously malignant, but I knew at once that my grandmother was not a good person, and was probably as mean-spirited and malicious as her own daughter Olivia. And what about my father? Who is he? I asked. Does he know about me? Your father is an unknown quantity, dear. He could be absolutely anyone. I told you my daughter was a little hussy back in the day. She gave me a gormless grin. She went with so many boys. You could be anybody's child. I had heard enough. Why had I come here to visit this stupid, implacable old woman who claimed to be my grandmother? She was sick in the head. She'd enjoyed telling me I'd never been wanted, that I was a grievous mistake that her daughter wanted to throw away and dispose of in a dumpster. Fancy telling that to someone. Oh, by the way, you were never wanted. I needed to get away from here as fast as I could. My grandmother's raucous words cut through me, cut through bone, marrow and sinew. My mother had never wanted me, and that really hurt. I'd heard enough. Up until this point in my life, I had never known what it felt like to be spurned. So there we are. That is the end of part 3 of our story. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.